Hi, welcome to our Facebook Live event. It is National Suicide Prevention Week. Starts this week, and September is National Suicide Prevention Month. So we're going to take some time today and talk about suicide and resources for those that have experienced loss due to suicide. One of the things we do want to mention, and we'll put in our comment section, that we have, if you are in crisis, we have the number for the hotline, which is 1-800-273-TALK, 8255, or you can text TALK to 741-741. So we'll put that in our comment sections as well, but just wanted to make sure that you guys are aware of that. Today I'm joined by Susan Coale, who's the director of the Chesapeake Life Center here at Hospice of the Chesapeake. And Susan, thanks for coming and talking with me. So suicide is such an intense topic, and even the language that we use to talk about it has a lot of weight to it. So I wanted to start today with sort of talking about the language and the words we use and why they matter, how we choose the words we use to describe suicide.
Yes, that's a really important thing to be aware of, particularly if you put yourself in the place of someone who is vulnerable, who is feeling the stigma. There's so much stigma associated with suicide. Think about how we call it committing suicide.
Right.
You know, we commit crimes, we commit sins, very negative, that imply that there's something bad about the person. And the stigma's a weighty thing, both for the grievers when they're feeling the stigma of having lost someone to suicide, then they're more reluctant to get the help that they might need. And yet, as a counselor for folks who are fragile and thinking about suicide, there the stigma can be helpful to keep it from looking like a viable option. But today, since we're talking about the grief, it's really important that we step away from that word of committing suicide. We don't commit a heart attack, we don't commit cancer, we die by a heart attack or we die from cancer. And so to just use that less stigmatizing language is really important. Another piece of that language is people who may attempt suicide, and then I've seen the language of someone who attempted suicide but didn't complete it. Sometimes people will say a failed suicide attempt. So again, think about someone who's fragile and feeling so worthless and in such despair, and now I've failed suicide. So that's another word that's important to think in terms of a completed suicide, and someone dying by suicide rather than
so to be really mindful and making sure you sort of think about the words that you're using, because they have like significant meaning to them, and trying to change the stigma by trying to use words. So it's better to say someone died by suicide.
Yes.
So that's sort of the better, healthier way to describe it. And then if someone's had a suicide attempt, the better way to talk about that is to say,
simply an attempt, but it was not completed.
Okay, all right, that's good to know. I forgot to mention at the beginning, if you all have any questions or comments, we welcome them as always. We'll try and respond. If we can't respond now, we'll try and make sure that we follow up. It is a really difficult topic to talk about, and grief for losing someone by suicide has got to be complicated. Grief, we've talked about this a couple of other times, grief in any way, shape, or form is complicated, but when you have a death by suicide, I can only imagine that makes it adds some different layers to it.
It does add more layers.
Is there, and we are always conscious about confidentiality and privacy, but I think it's sometimes helpful if you can share somebody's story without breaking that privacy. How anyone that you've worked with has sort of moved through or had a loss by suicide and sort of what their story was, if you could share that.
I worked with a woman a number of years ago whose partner had died by suicide.
Okay.
They'd been together a long time. It felt like a really solid relationship, certainly with all the stresses of raising young children and jobs and all of that. And she was completely, had no idea, no warning that he was going to take his life.
Wow.
And just all of the issues, as you say, there's all of the issues to take care of when someone has died.
Right.
But for her, that idea of, did I somehow cause this? What did I miss? Was it my fault? What caused him? And in the process, we want to understand, we sometimes place blame or accept guilt because we want to make sense out of something.
Right.
And suicide, particularly in this where he had not been diagnosed as being depressed.
So she had to have felt blindsided, I'm guessing.
Right.
Yeah,
Completely.
Yeah.
And so for her, there was a lot of sort of going back and trying to understand what happened, what led up to it.
Right.
And then discovering that there were financial issues, then thinking about his behavior and recognizing, he had been depressed.
Right.
And yet in the way that so many men are depressed, not overtly showing it, things that she wouldn't have recognized.
Yeah.
So there was all of that, why? And ultimately it's a question that we often don't know the answer to, but that really haunts people who've lost a loved one to suicide. And along with that, as they say, is that guilt and blame and that the stigma, that wondering, do people think it's my fault?
Right, or people looking at me saying,
oh, boy, she looks normal, but she must be crazy.
Right.
What did she do?
Yeah.
And then what to tell the children, young children, and what to say, how much to say, how do they understand it? And the whole idea, and it's another one sort of borders on that language, is the idea of choosing suicide.
Yeah.
Why did he choose to do that? And there we talk a lot about the language of whether a choice is really possible. That
Right.
ultimately in that moment, there doesn't seem to be the ability of our brains to be making a rational choice.
I think that's probably one of the biggest components of trying to help people make sense or understand it, is that it really isn't a choice. Like, it's so the person that's experiencing the depression or the darkness or the urge to not live any longer, from my understanding, is just, it's so weighted on them. It is so, all encompassing.
Right.
That you can't see the light. Like that you're right. Like the choice, it's not really a choice. It's
Right.
It's so much pain. Like if you try and think about how much pain you've ever been in, physical pain, and equate it to emotional, psychological pain, that sort of,
And that's it.
And you just want it to stop, right?
Right.
Like you just want it to stop.
And that's it exactly. Research that's been done with people who have attempted suicide indicates that most often it is about pain. It's not about wanting to die.
Right.
It's about ending the pain.
And it's not seeing anybody else. It's not
suicidal trance is what we call it. That it
Interesting.
narrows down. So whereas someone who's not in that space might see all kinds of options for dealing with issues, they don't. It just narrows
tunnel.
down. This is it. That kind of a trance.
Yeah.
So.
Wow. So if you're just joining us, Susan Coale, who is the director of the Chesapeake Life Center, is with me today, and we're talking about suicide and grief when someone loses someone to suicide. And we've sort of recapped why the language, why when we talk about death by suicide, the words that we use are important. And we've talked a little bit about how the grief when you've lost somebody from suicide is different. What I'd like to spend the rest of our time today talking about is sort of resources, what's out there, and what would you recommend, specifically online. Let's go a little bit online resources.
can I just throw in one more
Oh,
little
yeah.
piece that's really important,
Sure.
important aspect, is that there's also almost always an element of trauma with the suicide loss. That whether or not the griever finds the deceased person, there tends to be an imaginative process. This woman that I spoke of
Yeah.
didn't see her husband's body and had nightmares for months and months and months about how he had died. And so there's that other layer of trauma in addition. So really, really complex.
Yeah. And I want to back up a second too before we jump to the resources. I did want to mention too, like our question, ask you about what about if we've experienced someone or we know someone who's lost a loved one to suicide. What are some things as we as family or friends or coworkers should or shouldn't say? Because I think sometimes you want to ask, but it's just this it's such a different, even from a peripheral perspective, it's such a different connection regarding the loss itself. It feels different. Is there anything you could suggest regarding how people should react or shouldn't?
It's, again, really important to be thoughtful, and that by nature we're curious. We want to understand why too, even if we're way out. Sometimes we think about concentric circles, so that particularly in a suicide loss, here's the immediate people that have been impacted, and then there are the people around them, the friends, the coworkers, the folks that they see periodically, and then the farther out, the lady at the bank is way out here.
Right.
But we're humans and we're really curious.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that we do is we give people permission they can restrict information to hear, not out of stigma, but out of respect for their privacy.
Right.
And so, if somebody out here asks, they can say, I'd rather not talk about it. It's personal, it's private, I don't want to talk about it. So it's important to let people know, I'm here for you if you want to talk, but I'm not going to ask a lot of questions. Don't, that's our voyeuristic self,
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that's probably the most important thing, is to communicate, to be present, but not to ask a lot of
But not
questions.
Expectations for any,
Right,
yeah.
and it's not helpful to gossip and guess with friends and all of that.
Yeah.
I've seen people be really hurt by that.
Yeah. I would think that could almost be re-traumatizing or
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
What about social media? Any thoughts on, you tend to see a lot more on social media platforms when someone dies by suicide. The information spreads very quickly, and like you said, we are voyeuristic by nature, and it seems to just sort of build or feed. Is there any suggestions that you would have regarding social media platforms, things that, are they helpful, are they not? Like, what's your sort of...
I think they can be helpful in terms of knowing that there are people here around me that care. And certainly for people who don't quite know what to say, what's the right thing to say, it's sort of easier to just post something. And what's appropriate is condolences. Again, lots of questions, lots of speculation. I heard this, I heard that, he looked this way, he looked that way. Those kinds of things aren't helpful, and again, provide distress.
So that would probably be a really helpful tip for parents to share with their kids,
Yes.
because I think that generation, like that's, the mode of communication, or the younger generation is definitely on, so it would probably be helpful for parents just to, guide.
Absolutely, to guide, and to not, particularly for children and teens, to not glorify the person who died by suicide. That, again, particularly for vulnerable teens, if they hear of another teen who has taken their own life, then everyone just says all of these wonderful things about them, and it feels like if they're vulnerable, like, wow, if I die, everybody's going to say these wonderful things, and they're going to put up a plaque, and so again, that makes it look more enticing.
Right.
So we don't want to do that. So
Right.
to be balanced when we talk to kids about that.
Do you go and speak to schools or counselors or anything like that?
Chesapeake Life Center does provide continuing education for
Okay.
local professionals, school systems. Sometimes if something happens in a school, they'll reach out and talk with us about how to handle it and such. And the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention also offers a free toolkit for schools to know how to respond.
That's awesome. So talking about resources then, going back to that, is there anything specific that you would recommend let's start with online resources?
Absolutely, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention has both resources for suicide prevention and resources for grievers. It's a wonderful resource. Also, What's Your Grief?
Okay.
Is a wonderful
Platform. Yep.
Where you can search for various kinds of loss, and it's an especially good tool for a normalization for grievers to know, oh yeah, I'm not alone. This is how people respond to this.
And I think they have podcasts and stuff too,
They
so
do
you can
too.
so it's What's Your Grief. We'll make sure that we connect that in our comments section as well, and they cover a lot of different types of grief, but grief, loss due to suicide is one of their topics that they cover.
Other popular websites are the American Association of Suicidology,
Okay.
also the Open to Hope Foundation,
Okay.
and the Alliance of Hope, I believe, is another one.
Okay, that's good to know. What about Chesapeake Life Center? I know a lot of grief support groups, counseling. Can you share a little bit about what's offered locally in Anne Arundel and Prince George's County?
We offer both individual counseling, family counseling. Sometimes we work with parents specifically on how to work with their children, or we see the children. And we have a monthly drop-in group for folks who have lost a loved one to suicide.
Okay.
It meets every month and is a wonderful, wonderful group of people. We just ask that folks call in to talk with counselors sort of as a screening and to make sure that they're ready and appropriate for a group. And so we can tell them a little bit about the group before they come.
How many people generally attend a group? Does that kind
Between 10 and 15 usually.
Okay. I know historically, I think you and I have talked a little bit before about how the Chesapeake Life Center got involved, just because of the need. So if you want to just share that, I think that's an interesting story, sort of how Hospice of the Chesapeake became involved with grief support for those who are grieving someone due to suicide.
It was very much in response to a community need. It was
Okay.
probably about 12 years ago or so. There were, within a school year, a couple of teens who died by suicide. And people reached out to us. At that time, we were called the Spiritual and Bereavement Care Center, and had bereavement in our name. We're affiliated with Hospice, so people figured we would know something, and so they called. We didn't know much at that point, but it was necessary that we learn, and so learn is what we did. And as quickly as we could learn and provide services, and of course that happened in tandem.
Right.
So we're learning according to the needs of the people who came to see us, and the people who come were of course the very best teachers, of what it was like. So we learn from the community, and then from there we reached out to other practitioners who didn't really know a lot about suicide grief either. So eventually then we began offering continuing education professionals.
Okay. That's great. That's such a valuable resource that I'm not sure a lot of people know about, but it's really nice to know that that's
We don't
there.
just provide support for hospice families.
That's great for the community. Thank you for
You're
being
very
here
welcome.
today. Appreciate your time. Thank you guys for watching. And if you again had any questions or comments, feel free to share. Thanks.